Bikers mock an elderly woman on the road, her identity leaves them begging for forgiveness. The hum of a well-maintained engine purred steadily as the sleek black sedan cruised down the open road. It wasn't fast, nor was it slow, just a steady, composed speed, perfectly controlled. Behind the wheel sat an elderly woman, silver-haired and poised, her face calm as she watched the asphalt stretch endlessly before her. The road was mostly empty, save for a few distant headlights flickering on the horizon. It was a peaceful drive, or at least, it was supposed to be. Then, the distant roar of engines shattered the tranquility. A group of bikers emerged from the far end of the road, their headlights forming a cluster of wild, erratic beams cutting through the dimming evening light. The roar of their engines grew louder, reverberating off the pavement as they sped forward in tight formation. Their bikes swerved aggressively between lanes, their laughter ringing through the air as they approached the solitary sedan ahead. The woman didn't react. She kept her hands steady on the wheel, her posture relaxed, as if she had encountered scenes like this before. One of the bikers, a tall man with a scruffy beard and a leather vest adorned with patches, revved his engine loudly as he pulled up alongside her. He grinned at his friends, then leaned in closer to her open window, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey there, Grandma. You sure you should be out here at this hour? Roads can be dangerous, you know." The others laughed, their voices blending into the growl of their engines. Another biker, younger and more reckless, cut in front of her car, intentionally slowing down to force her to brake. The woman tapped the brake lightly but made no sudden movements. "Maybe she's lost," one of them called out, his voice thick with amusement. "Maybe she forgot where she was going." The leader of the pack, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, gave a sharp whistle, signaling the others. They surrounded the sedan, tightening their circle, their taunts growing louder. "Maybe we should help her," he sneered, grinning as he pulled closer. "Wouldn't want her falling asleep at the wheel." Still, the woman didn't respond. She didn't even glance at them. Her silence unsettled one of the younger bikers. He had seen fear before, panicked expressions, trembling hands gripping steering wheels, eyes darting in all directions. But this woman, she was too calm. Too composed. It wasn't natural. "Come on, lady," the leader said, his voice turning sharper. "A little respect here. Acknowledge your superiors." For the first time, she moved. She reached up and adjusted her rearview mirror. A simple action, but one that made the younger biker shudder. The way she moved, it was too precise. Too measured. The leader didn't notice. He was too caught up in his performance. He leaned in even closer, his smirk widening. "What's the matter, Grandma? Cat got your tongue?" Finally, she turned her head ever so slightly, just enough for her sharp, piercing gaze to lock onto him. And for the first time that night, there was a shift in the air. Her eyes weren't frightened. They weren't confused. They were calculating. Cold. Like she had already assessed every single one of them. A flicker of something unreadable passed through the leader's face, but he masked it quickly, letting out a forced laugh. "Oh, she's got a death stare, huh?" The other bikers chuckled, but there was hesitation now. The woman had barely done anything, had barely spoken a word, yet suddenly, something felt off. Then she spoke, her voice smooth, deliberate, and impossibly steady. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" The leader blinked. The laughter from the others faded, just slightly. The woman turned back toward the road, unfazed by the group encircling her. "If you did," she continued, "you would have already apologized." A slow, eerie silence settled between them. The younger biker, the one who had felt uneasy from the beginning, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't know why, but his instincts screamed at him that they had just made a very, very big mistake. The leader forced another laugh, but this time, it was weaker. "That's so?" he muttered. The woman didn't answer. She simply waited. As if she knew exactly what was about to happen next. The air between them grew heavier. The distant sounds of the open road faded under the weight of the silence that followed her words. The woman hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made any threats, yet something in the way she spoke sent a ripple of unease through the group. The leader of the bikers, still straddling his motorcycle, scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, this is rich," he muttered. "Grandma thinks she's important." He turned toward his crew, gesturing toward her car with an exaggerated wave. "Did you hear that? We should have already apologized." His sarcasm drew a round of laughter, but it was forced, thinner than before. Some of the younger bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about this didn't feel right. One of them, a man in his mid-20s with sharp features and restless hands, leaned closer to the leader. "Boss, maybe we should." He didn't get to finish. The leader held up a hand, silencing him without even looking. His focus remained locked on the woman, a smug grin still stretched across his face. "Listen, lady," he said, voice laced with condescension. "You're out here, in the middle of nowhere, driving slow, holding up the road. You think you deserve some kind of respect? From us?" The woman exhaled through her nose, the barest hint of amusement flickering in her expression. She turned her gaze back to the leader, observing him like one might study an insect that had mistakenly wandered too close. "I think," she said slowly, deliberately, "that you don't understand the situation you've put yourselves in." The leader's grin twitched, faltering just slightly before he scoffed again. "Oh yeah." He leaned forward, resting his forearm against the handlebar of his bike. "And what situation is that, exactly?" The woman tilted her head, her silver hair catching the soft glow of the moon above. "You'll find out soon enough." The unease in the group grew stronger. The leader could feel it, though he refused to acknowledge it. He needed to keep control. He needed to show them that he wasn't afraid of some old woman on the highway. With a slow, exaggerated motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a switchblade. The sharp metal gleamed under the dim light. "See, I don't like mysteries," he said, flipping the blade open with a practiced flick. "I like things to be real simple." "So why don't you?" A distant sound cut him off. A low rumble. Faint at first. Unnoticeable to anyone not paying attention. But the woman heard it. And she smiled. The leader didn't notice at first. He was too caught up in his performance, too focused on keeping his gang entertained. But then the sound grew louder. One of the younger bikers turned his head, squinting toward the horizon. Boss?" The leader ignored him. "You got a smart mouth for someone in your position, lady." The rumble became more distinct, rhythmic. The unmistakable sound of engines. Not motorcycles. Something heavier. Stronger. Vehicles. Multiple. Moving fast. The woman remained still, her hands resting lightly against her car door. She was waiting. The leader finally noticed the change in atmosphere. The laughter was gone now. The bikers were looking around, shifting uneasily on their seats. He turned his head sharply, eyes narrowing at the approaching lights in the distance. The woman followed his gaze before looking back at him, her expression unreadable. "You're about to learn a lesson," she said, voice steady. "One you won't forget." The leader turned back to her, gripping the handle of his knife tighter. "What the hell is this?" No one answered. Because now, the roaring engines weren't just distant anymore. They were almost here. The rumbling grew louder. It wasn't just one vehicle. It was several. Heavy engines, their deep growls cutting through the night like rolling thunder. The bikers shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward the distant headlights that were now approaching faster than before. The leader tightened his grip on the switchblade, his jaw locking. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, glancing between the woman and the growing lights in the distance. The woman didn't answer. She simply waited. One of the younger bikers cursed under his breath. "Boss, maybe we should go." The leader snapped his head toward him. "Shut up," he barked, though his own uncertainty was starting to show. He turned back to the woman, pointing the knife at her. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not working on me." The woman lifted an eyebrow, her gaze slow and deliberate as she eyed the blade in his hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, untouched by the chaos unraveling around her. "You think you're in control of this situation," she said, almost as if she were pitying him. The leader took a step forward, trying to regain the confidence that was slipping from his grasp. "And you think you are?" The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "No," she said simply, "but they are." She tilted her chin toward the road behind them. The leader turned, finally acknowledging the dozen black SUVs that were now pulling onto the highway, their headlights flooding the road. The bikers stiffened. The leader blinked. The vehicles were massive. Not police cars. Not civilian vehicles. Something else. Something important. They rolled in unison, smooth and disciplined, like they had done this 1,000 times before. Within seconds, the lead SUV came to a stop directly behind the bikers, followed by the others, boxing them in. The air became suffocatingly tense. No one spoke. Then, with a cold efficiency, the first SUV's driver's side door swung open. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit. His posture was rigid, his movements calculated. He wasn't a cop. That much was obvious. The leader swallowed, his fingers twitching slightly around the handle of his knife. Then another door opened. And another. More men, similarly dressed, exited the vehicles. Their expressions were unreadable, their presence commanding. These weren't ordinary men. The woman finally moved. She stepped away from her car, her silver hair catching the glow of the SUV headlights. The leader instinctively took a step back. He didn't even realize he had done it. The woman watched him, then slowly turned her gaze to the men standing behind the SUVs. "You took your time," she said casually. The suited man who had stepped out first nodded respectfully. "Apologies, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and unwavering. "We were ensuring your route was secure." "Ma'am. Not miss. Not lady. Ma'am." Like she outranked them. The realization sank in like a lead weight. The leader's stomach twisted. His hand loosened on the knife. His gang members weren't laughing anymore. They weren't even moving. They had mocked her. Surrounded her. Tried to intimidate her. And now they were standing in front of someone important enough to have an armed escort waiting for her. The woman turned back to the leader, and for the first time, there was something resembling amusement in her gaze. "Still think I should apologize to you?" The leader's mouth opened. But no words came out. Because now, for the first time in his life, he was afraid. The leader's grip on the knife weakened, his fingers twitching. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. The woman had barely said anything, had barely moved, and yet, somehow, the entire situation had flipped. The bikers, who moments ago had been mocking her, were now frozen in place. The men from the SUVs stood in perfect formation, their expressions unreadable, their presence commanding. They weren't ordinary security. They were something else. One of the younger bikers whispered, "Boss, what the hell is this?" The leader didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry. The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly. She wasn't angry. She wasn't amused. She was simply waiting. Then, the suited man closest to her stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a silent message. These men were in control now. "You've caused quite the disturbance tonight," the suited man said, his tone polite but firm. His gaze flicked over the gang before settling on the leader. "I assume none of you were aware of who you were harassing." The leader swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to say something, to fix this, but he had no words. "Allow me to make introductions," the man continued, gesturing slightly toward the woman. "You are standing before." But the woman lifted a hand, stopping him. She turned back to the leader, her gaze level. "They don't need to know my name," she said. They just need to understand their mistake. The leader flinched. Her voice wasn't threatening. It wasn't raised. But it carried weight. Real power. And for the first time in a long time, he felt completely powerless. Another one of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Look, lady, we didn't mean any harm, he muttered, his confidence draining with every word. The woman didn't reply. She just stared at him. And that was somehow worse. The leader took a slow, measured breath, trying to regain control. Okay, he said, forcing out a chuckle that sounded weaker than he wanted. Okay, so maybe we were a little out of line. A little. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. The woman arched an eyebrow, but she didn't need to say anything. Everyone standing there knew that wasn't enough. The leader felt his pride pushing against the walls of his own survival instincts. He wanted to keep his tough guy act going, wanted to hold on to what little control he had left. But looking at her, looking at the men behind her, he knew better. And so, for the first time that night, he did something he never thought he'd do. He took a step back. And he lowered the knife. It wasn't much. But it was the only way to show he understood. The woman nodded slightly, as if that was the only response she expected. She turned, beginning to walk toward her car, her movements calm and composed. She had already won, and she knew it. But just before she reached the door, she paused. She looked back, her expression unreadable once more. And then she spoke the words that sealed their fate. This won't be forgotten. The leader felt his stomach drop. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a fact. And suddenly, he realized. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The leader felt his breath catch in his throat. His fingers twitched at his sides, his mind racing for an escape, for a way out of this nightmare. The woman had barely done anything, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a single threat. And yet, somehow, she had left them standing there like children caught red-handed in something they didn't fully understand. The other bikers weren't laughing anymore. One of them, the youngest, took a slow step backward, glancing at the others as if silently asking if they should run. But where would they go? The SUVs boxed them in, their black surfaces gleaming under the dim glow of the road lamps. The men who had stepped out of them hadn't even moved yet. They were just watching. Waiting. The weight of their presence pressed down on the bikers, suffocating, unshakable. The leader swallowed hard, forcing himself to straighten his back. He had to regain control. He had to salvage this. He cleared his throat. Look, he said, voice hoarse. We didn't mean anything by it. Just some fun on the road, that's all. The woman studied him for a moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, she shook her head. No, she said simply. The leader frowned. No? The woman exhaled through her nose, almost like she was disappointed. This wasn't just fun. This was a mistake. The words cut deeper than any threat ever could. The leader clenched his jaw, but before he could respond, the suited man beside her took a step forward. Just one. The effect was instant. Every biker flinched. Not because he had raised a weapon. Not because he had even spoken yet. But because they could feel it. This was not a man you wanted to test. The suited man adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, his expression unreadable. Names, he said. The leader's breath hitched. What? The suited man tilted his head, his gaze dark and unwavering. Your names, he repeated. All of you. The leader stiffened. Why the hell would we give you that? The suited man smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that made your stomach turn. Because, he said, voice eerily calm, you want to make this right, don't you? A new kind of fear gripped the bikers. This wasn't just about tonight anymore. This was about tomorrow. About what came next. The leader's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of every single choice he had made up until this moment crashing down on him. The woman, still standing quietly beside the man, crossed her arms. "You should listen to him," she said. "I would." The leader's heart slammed against his ribs. Because suddenly, he understood. This wasn't a choice. This was a command. He looked at the other bikers. They were waiting for him. Their eyes pleading. Begging him to fix this. To make sure they all walked away from this night. The leader gritted his teeth. Then, slowly, painfully, he spoke his name. And one by one, the others did too. They didn't dare look at the woman. Because they already knew. They would never forget her. And they would never be the same again. The names hung in the air like a confession, thick with regret and desperation. Each biker spoke hesitantly, their voices barely above a whisper, as if saying their names out loud somehow sealed their fate. The leader's jaw was tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides, but even he knew, this was no longer a fight he could win. The suited man nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing less. He pulled out a sleek black notebook from the inside of his jacket, flipping it open with a practiced motion. Then, with the same eerie calmness that had unsettled them from the start, he began writing. One name. Then another. And another. The scratching of pen against paper felt heavier than the roar of their engines had earlier that night. The leader clenched his teeth. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hollow. The suited man didn't look up. "That depends," he said, finishing the last name before shutting the notebook. He tucked it back into his jacket with the same ease, as if he hadn't just marked them for something they couldn't yet comprehend. The woman finally stepped forward. Her silver hair gleamed under the lights, her expression calm but unreadable. "I have no interest in ruining your lives," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "But I also don't believe in letting people walk away without consequences." One of the younger bikers exhaled sharply, his hands shaking. "Please," he muttered. We didn't know who you were." The woman tilted her head, observing him. "And that's supposed to matter?" He swallowed hard. "We wouldn't have." She lifted a hand, cutting him off. "No. Don't do that." The younger biker went silent immediately. The leader, still trying to hold on to some shred of his pride, squared his shoulders. "You've made your point," he said, though there was no conviction behind his words. "We messed up. We get it." The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes," she said. "You do." The silence stretched. The bikers weren't sure if that meant they were free to go, if they had somehow been spared. Then, the suited man stepped forward once more, his voice smooth as silk. "Your bikes," he said. The leader frowned. "What?" The suited man gestured to the row of motorcycles. "Leave them." A sharp, collective inhale ran through the group. The leader stiffened. "Are you joking?" The suited man's face remained expressionless. "No." The leader's pulse pounded against his skull. "You want our bikes?" His voice wavered between disbelief and rage. "You can't just take them." The woman arched an eyebrow. "Can't I?" And suddenly, the leader understood. This wasn't about stealing. This was about humbling them. Their bikes weren't just machines, they were their pride. Their status. Their identity. And now, they were being taken. One of the bikers, a younger man who had barely spoken all night, made a broken noise in the back of his throat. "Boss." The leader knew. He knew they had no choice. If they refused, things would get worse. Much worse. His pride screamed at him to fight back. To refuse. But his survival instincts were louder. So, slowly, painfully, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and tossed it onto the pavement. One by one, the others did the same. They didn't speak. Didn't look at each other. Because deep down, they knew. They were already defeated. The keys lay scattered on the pavement, glinting under the headlights of the SUVs. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of their decision pressed down on them like a crushing force. The leader's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled frustration. He had never felt this helpless before, this small. The woman, still poised, still calm, took a single step forward. It wasn't a large movement, but it was enough. Enough to remind them who was in control. "Smart choice," she said, her voice devoid of mockery. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't rubbing it in. That, somehow, made it worse. The suited man beside her gave a nod to the others. Within seconds, several of them moved in perfect unison, collecting the keys and mounting the abandoned motorcycles. Engines roared to life, except this time, they weren't in the hands of their original owners. The bikers watched helplessly as their bikes, their prized possessions, were driven away into the night. One by one, the powerful machines disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only silence in their wake. The leader clenched his fists. The rage, the humiliation, the overwhelming sense of defeat burned through him. The woman regarded him for a moment before speaking again. "I hope this is the last time you underestimate someone based on appearance," she said, her words slow and deliberate. The leader gritted his teeth. Who are you?" It was the question that had lingered in the air all night. The question they should have asked before it was too late. The woman tilted her head slightly. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said. "What matters is that you'll remember me." And he would. They all would. The leader exhaled sharply, staring at the ground. He couldn't look at her. Couldn't meet her eyes. She had already won. The suited man adjusted his cuffs before taking a step back toward the SUV. "I'd suggest you start walking," he said simply. "Before the next group that comes through isn't as generous as we are." One of the younger bikers swallowed hard. You're leaving us here." The woman didn't even blink. "That's what you did to me, wasn't it?" No one had an answer for that. The leader's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the truth was suffocating. There was nothing left to say. The woman turned without another word, walking toward her car with effortless grace. She had been in control from the moment they stopped her on the road. She had never been the victim. She had always been the lesson. The car door closed with a soft click. The SUV doors followed, the men filing back into their vehicles like soldiers returning from a battle they had already won. The bikers stood motionless, their bodies stiff with shock as the engines roared to life. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone. The road was empty again. Except now, the bikers weren't riding. They were walking. Humbled. Broken. And forever changed.